Well, I just want to begin with a thank you. This is a really good crowd for the weather and the forecast and everything. And I would also like to say thank you for the people who are online. I always like coming here, and I've been invited here many times, and so I just really appreciate it. It's actually a highlight for my wife and I to come. She couldn't make it this year. So I'll just be going straight home. Usually we go to a restaurant around town afterwards. But anyway, thank you so much for the invitation. What I'm hoping to do today is to talk about World War II, the home front, and just to kind of begin with, I guess, a little bit of a focus or what are the goals that I have. When we think of World War II, often we think of the soldiers in the field. We think of politicians who are making decisions as to whether or not we should or should not go to war. We think about generals who are making decisions when it comes to strategy and things like that. But today's focus will be more on the home front because warfare impacts people's homes. Often, and what I try to do in the classes that I teach is I try to maintain a balance between traditional approaches to history that focus on politicians and monarchs and acts passed by Congress and things like that, which is really, really important. However, how about women's lives? How about the impact of the American family? How about issues of race and things like that? So what I try to do is maintain a balance between the different focal points, politics, and acts passed by Congress and actions of presidents and monarchs. That's the backbone. That's your chronology. But how about everybody else? How about average people and how national or international events impact them? So what I'd like to focus on is the fact that in many ways, the United States was united and very patriotic in its support for the war, particularly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Prior to that, there was a lot of there was a movement called the America First organization. Charles Lindbergh was involved with it, trying to keep the United States out of the Second World War. But really, after the Japanese attack, we see a lot of patriotism. I want to show how, in order to win this war, we see a big growth in the size and the power of the national government. Now, maybe you think that's a good thing. Maybe you think that's not a good thing, but it was necessary during the war in order to fight a war in the European theater as well as in Asia. So we see that. I want to focus here on issues of gender, family life, and race. One of the things that I'll point out is the fact that marriages increased during the war. So too did divorces. And so it's because of the disruptions that were caused by the mobilization of American society. And while I do want to address national trends, I want to give a lot of focus to Michigan because that's where we live, and that's where the Arsenal democracy was located in order to defeat Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy. So that's kind of where I'd like to begin. Okay, so World War II was very expensive. If you were to look at the cost of the Second World War, its average was approximately $250 million a day. $250 million a day. Well, the first way, and I'll gauge the crowd here. How did they get their money? Well, they got it the old-fashioned way. They borrowed it. Okay. All right. So yes, if you remember, what was it? It was the banking. What was it? We earn money the old fashioned way. We earn it. Okay. In those commercials, but I put a little twist on that. So what we see is that the United States went into debt, a great deal of debt, in order to fight the Second World War and in order to have the war materiel. And you can see this poster to generate support for people. Well, even if you're not a soldier in the field, you can back him up, okay, by purchasing war bonds. And so that's one of the things that you see there. We see an increase in the national debt in that era, again, in order to fight this war. And by the way, just as far as the war aims were set up, is that yes, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, but the focal point was actually to defeat Germany first and Japan, and then to defeat Japan, and with the fewest number of American casualties possible. That was basically the focal point that the government took. So in order to generate this, in order to generate the money, okay, Congress passed a series of pieces of legislation. One of those solutions was the Revenue Act, and then there was another act called the Tax Payment Act. There had been withholding taxes implemented for a short time during World War I. And then the Social Security Act, which had been passed in the 1930s, also had withholding tax, but that was expanded during World War II. The government needed the money every 2 weeks when everybody got their paychecks. I often say to students, when do you pay your taxes? And they say April 15th. And I say, really? And if you get your check, you look at the back, and the money is actually taken out, every 2 weeks or every month if that's when you're paid. We also see that the tax rates for everyone were increased. Here we see growth in the government's power to gain access to that tax revenue. That's a power, growth there. But also, well, let's look at the tax rates. At the end of the war, 1944, I guess you say, the highest tax rate was 94%. Let me repeat that. The highest tax rate was 94%. That was for people who had an income of over $200,000. So maybe for the first $200,000, you were taxed at 30%, something like that, maybe 35. I don't know what the other, the graduated tax rates were, but the highest rate, if you were making 200,000, anything over $200,000 was taxed at 94%. Congress passed this legislation in order to have the revenue, in order to get enough money, in order to have the supplies, in order to defeat Japan and Germany. And if you were to kind of translate that, that's about $2.5 million today. Okay. So I say that to students, and it's a big wow. Okay. So you may say to yourself, well, is the debt that we have today, is that from World War II? No. Okay. So if you look here, this is the national debt. This is as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product. Okay, so here you see a peak. The tax rates were lowered over the years, but you see that down here in 1980, that original debt had been paid off, but beginning in the 1980s, we see a growth in more of the debt. So the debt that we have today is not from World War II. Okay. And actually the debt was actually doing okay, probably roughly until about 1980. All right. That's one aspect, this financial aspect. The taxes are being raised there, but we also see growth in the government size and power. And I just want to talk about a couple of government agencies, one being the War Productions Board and the others, the Office of Price Administration. Franklin Roosevelt was president during World War II. He had also been president during the 1930s, and he was famous for the so-called New Deal. That was the alphabet soup of American history, Social Security Act, TVA, WPA, PWA, the alphabet agencies. There were more agencies that were created during World War II as well. The War Productions Board was in charge of that conversion of the U.S. economy to producing war materials. Hitler said, oh, Americans are only good at producing radios and refrigerators. Well, the U.S. economy actually shifted from radios, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and things like that to tanks, planes, engines, jeeps, and other war material. Michigan was famous for becoming the arsenal of democracy, and we see a book from that title, and you can also see some of the examples of some statistics associated with the products that were produced in the state of Michigan. The best example of this mobilization of the U.S. economy was seen in the auto industry. There already were manufacturing plants in the state of Michigan. There already was a large group of laborers who knew how to work in those factories. So Michigan was a logical place in order to make a lot of those war materials. One thing too, during the Second World War, it was basically impossible to get a new car because they literally stopped producing new cars and they shifted to producing war materials. So the person in charge of this was William Knudsen. He had been an auto executive for Ford and then at GM, and he was quote unquote drafted by Franklin Roosevelt, and he was one of a group of famous patriotic men who left private industry, worked for the government, and they famously signed contracts for literally a payment. They were paid $1 a year. So they were called $1 a year men. He was one of many of these men who worked for the government at demonstrating their patriotism during the war. If you were to look at some of the specific companies, some definitely, we recognize. Chrysler focused on producing tanks at one facility in Warren, Michigan. 22,000 tanks were produced at that one facility, more than the country of Germany. And, Germany's famous for its manufacturing. So that just tells you there was a tremendous investment by the government. This was a partnership between government and private business in order to produce the materials needed in order to defeat the Axis powers. So Chrysler focused on tanks, Ford on these four-wheel drive vehicles that could go just about anywhere, Jeeps. They also produced planes and I'll talk a little bit more detail about Willow Run here in a little bit. But when the Willow Run facility was produced, it had an assembly line of over a mile and in length and about a quarter mile in its width. Here we see some images. Okay, so on the left, you've got a group of people, men and women, who were making parts for the to produce airplanes. And on the right, you see this huge assembly line. Ford claimed at the beginning of the war that he could mass produce planes just as he had perfected the assembly line. Ford didn't invent the assembly line, but he perfected it. Okay, and a plane is so much more complicated and so much more larger than an automobile that critics said there's no way you could do that. Well, by the end of the war, about one plane was completed every hour. It took a long time in order for the supply chains to build up, for the design of the facility as well as the planes to be finalized, to standardize the production of all of those parts so that they could be assembled by different workers on that moving assembly line. And I love this photo on the right because you could see the fuselage of each of these planes, which I'm sure had all of the door stops in them. Yeah, so anyway, just yeah, that bad joke, I suppose, but something that's current right now. So by the way, Willow Run was built like in an empty area. And so there were lots of complications that were there. And you needed to have workers work. Thousands of workers were needed. And those workers needed a place to live. And so there were housing shortages and all sorts of things, again, that I'll talk about a little bit, that demonstrate the impact of war on civilians here on the home front. This isn't to say that soldiers in the field were putting their lives at stake, but civilians here were also impacted tremendously by the war. I guess I do have something with Boeing here. So anyway, Michigan did receive a disproportionate amount of the government contracts to produce items during the war, but there was also the government didn't just want the contracts to go to certain parts of the country. They wanted it to be diversified, because if the United States itself was ever attacked, they didn't want one physical location to be this arsenal of democracy. So on the West Coast in Oregon, you see Kaiser shipyards, and on the right, you see planes that are being produced in Boeing. Also, that helps, if they're on the West Coast, it's easier for them to then transport those to the Pacific theater during the war. But if we go back to Michigan, all right, Dow Chemical operated in Michigan prior to the war, but they eventually created a plastic wrapping agent that somehow had civilian application after the war. So we've got saran wrap. I didn't know that until I was doing research dealing with different companies and the impact of the war. And Kellogg's was another Michigan company, Battle Creek, okay, that you need to feed soldiers out in the field. And so millions of food rations, K rations, which I don't know for sure if it's called a K ration because Kellogg's produce them, but it's possible. I just don't know. Does anybody here know? Some of you. What's that? Is that right? Okay, I did not know that. So that's I've wondered that over the years. Okay. Oh, he said it was because of the word complete, and they started it with the letter K, or those are C rations actually. Yeah, yeah. Okay, but it's still called K. K's. Okay, all right. I did not know that. All right. So War Productions Board focused on the producing war materials from civilian goods to war supplies. The other government agency that I mentioned before was the Office of Price Administration, or the OPA. This was in charge of rationing goods. During World War I, people were encouraged to cut back on purchasing certain items, but during World War II, they literally rationed a range of goods. And I've just got a few examples here: steel, sugar, coffee, rubber, gasoline, flour. There were many, many items that were rationed. So my parents were both born in 1936, and I remember my mom telling me that when they purchased toothpaste, if you wanted to purchase toothpaste, you had to bring your empty toothpaste tube, which was not made of plastic, okay, that we get today, all right? You would turn that in, and then you could purchase your new tube of toothpaste. Okay? So I just remember that as one of the things that my mom talked about. So my understanding, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the talk, is that this spring there will be a new exhibit at the museum, and it will focus on World War II, the home front. And by the way, if you have, if it's okay if I say this, I'm interrupting the talk, but if you have photos of family members, anybody from Benzie County who was living here, if you could share those, if you could bring them in, and I'm guessing that they will scan them for you and then give them back. Okay, all right. If you could do that, that would be a wonderful addition to that museum piece, that exhibit, because as people enter the exhibit, they're hoping to have those faces. So if you could maybe do that, I think that would be great. Sure, no problem. And one other thing and this is what reminded me of this, is that if you, and many of you are probably familiar with this, but if you wanted to get 5 gallons of gas, okay, you needed the money for the gas, but you also needed your ration card, okay, or your coupons that are located here. And a family, let's say you had a family of 4, and one of the people in the family might have worked in a defense industry, and they knew that they had to drive a certain way or a certain distance. So your family would receive a certain number of these coupons from the ration book in order to get enough flour and coffee and gas and other things based upon the number of people in the home. And so here we just see a few examples, and my understanding is that there's going to be a lot of examples of that at the exhibit this spring. All right, so they had a slogan with the OPA. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. Again, in order to encourage people to cut down on certain products and to do things as much as they could voluntarily, but the items were also rationed. And students, well, I don't know if they love this, but I usually get a kick out of their reaction when I say, what do you think the national speed limit was during World War II? And, you know, it was 35 miles an hour, because I say to them, if you have to drive 100 miles and one person drives 75 miles an hour and another person drives 35 miles an hour, who's going to use more gasoline? Okay. Of course, it's the person that's going at the slower rate. And if your cars are similar, you know, if all these other criteria. And so in order to try to discourage people from overusing gasoline, this national speed limit was implemented. And by the way, it was virtually impossible to get new tires, so people would patch their tires. It was just, there were so many materials that were saved for the war effort. And again, you know, there were attempts to try to encourage people to cut down on gasoline. And I hadn't heard of the phrase car club, but, you know, carpool. So, you know, you can contribute to the war effort. Can you help this soldier in the field by cutting back on your gasoline consumption by joining a car club? You know, that's the message that's on the left. And then on the right, nylons could be used for parachutes. And so here you see there were scrap metal drives, scrap rubber drives, scrap nylon drives, okay? And again, another thing that I say to students is I say, well, if you couldn't wear nylons, and back in the day, okay, and some of you may know this better than me, okay, well, I guess I should keep here on the Zoom. There was a black line that would be shown on the back of a woman's leg who was wearing nylons. Well, one way that a woman could show her patriotism is to not wear her nylons and still draw that line up her back leg. Okay. Again, different behaviors, different things changing as a result of American involvement in the war. I'm a big baseball fan, okay? And baseball is our national pastime. The highest paid player in Major League Baseball is shown here in 1941. He played for the Tigers. His salary was $55,000 a year. He ended up changing uniforms and he made $21 a month. Does anyone know the name of this ball player? We've got, well, I think I heard Ty Cobb, okay, but I think I heard it in the back, Hank Greenberg, okay? Hank Greenberg spent time in the service, and those were some of his, he was in his prime, okay? And he ended up, you know, it interrupted his great career. You know, other ball players like Ted Williams, Bob Feller, DiMaggio, yeah, did Ted Musial as well? Yeah, okay. Ronald Reagan was worked for the War Department, and that. But you've got these Major League Baseball players who, and you know, these athletes who demonstrated their patriotism. In some cases, they were drafted, but in many cases, they volunteered. Okay. One thing too is that these days, if you go to a high school football game, volleyball game, baseball game, whatever, you will hear the national anthem. Well, prior to World War II, the national anthem was sung on opening day, you know, in April. And it was sung maybe at all 7 games of the World Series, or at least the first game of the World Series. But they started a new tradition during World War II. They sang the national anthem at the beginning, or at the beginning of every baseball game, again demonstrating the patriotism throughout the country. You saw, I guess I saw a little bit of this after 9/11. As they sang not only the national anthem, but um, oh, God bless America. Thank you. Thank you. So, all right. We also see just some figures here, okay, with recruiting posters. Hey, men, join the army, follow me. And we see some statistics here as to the size of the military and how many ended up serving in the armed forces. By the way, even prior to the American involvement in the Second World War, we did have a peacetime draft in 1940. That was the very first time we had a peacetime draft. But then that was ratcheted up after the United States became involved. And on the right, we see, a recruiting poster because real men make the Navy. Some of these posters reflected the stereotypes and racial, they were derogatory, okay, toward our enemies. So here we see an American eagle. Okay, the United States often is symbolized by an eagle. All right. Japanese is symbolized by a serpent. Okay. Very negative connotation. Also, we've got the buck teeth and the big eyes. Same here. We've got a rat. Okay. A Japanese soldier portrayed as a rat here. So these were used, in order to generate support for the war effort, and they also contain many negative racial stereotypes. The United States experienced an economic boom during the Second World War. We see on the left the growth of the increase in the gross national product, the value of things that were being produced, and we also see an increase in wages for employees or people working in those factories. And again, I've got some statistics here. These are approximate figures, but you see from on the eve of the Second World War versus the end of the war, average salaries about double. And in 1933, that was really the worst year, the Great Depression. Unemployment in the state of Michigan was 46%. 46. And by 1944, unemployment virtually ceased to exist. Employees, it's less than 1%. So employees could say, oh, well, if I go to this Packard plant, I can get this much money. And then they say, oh, no, I can go over here and I can work at Willow Run and I can get a little bit more, or I can get some extra overtime. Or, you know what? I just don't feel like working for a couple of weeks because I've been mandated to work overtime and I've never had so much money. And so they might step out of the workforce for a short period of time and then go back into it. There was a lot of, if you wanted a job, you could get one. And different states benefited more than others. We see that states like Washington and Michigan grew in size because that's where there were a lot of defense industries. California grew the most. So really, California has been the largest state in the union for several decades. It's really it was growing before World War II, but really World War II led to much more manufacturing in the state of California, and we see a lot of people moving there. Many African Americans, which I'll talk about here in a minute, move from the South. Many African Americans, as well as whites, move from the South with its agricultural foundation of its economy, and a lot of sharecroppers move from the South and they go north or they go west or both in order to get those jobs, because a lot of these manufacturing plants were looking for employees in order to work. Women's roles were impacted dramatically by American involvement in the war. We see a statistic here, 6.5 million women enter the workforce. So this is in addition to the women who were already in the workforce. And generally speaking, there was no equal pay for equal work. The attitude at the time was, if a man is doing a job and if a woman is doing the same job, it's okay to pay a woman less money because she's only supplementing the family's income as opposed to being the primary wage earner. So it was okay to do that. And so that was very, very typical. Um, what kind of jobs did they have? Well, there were a lot of positions that where you could work. You needed clerical people, whether they were in the private sector or they were in government. And I'd like to contrast a couple of things here. Here we see, well, you keep them flying, Miss USA. We've got a blonde hair, blue-eyed, beautiful young woman with red, white, and blue in the background. She's got a nice ribbon in her hair. Okay? And she's working in a position, a secretarial type of position, okay? Demonstrating her femininity. She looks very pretty. Okay? You see her longer hair and that. And here we see, Rosie the Riveter, okay, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Well, okay, so what she's saying, okay, a lot of people said, well, women can't do that. A woman wouldn't be as good as a man. Okay? That's not a woman's position. You want to make a bet? She says, okay. She's showing her muscle here. Okay. This is a very traditional occupation for a woman to be involved as an office working in an office. She's not working in an office. Okay. She may have long hair, but her hair is covered because she's got work to do. Okay. She doesn't want any of her long hair to get caught in any of the machinery that she's working with. And so here we see there are multiple opportunities for women that in many cases weren't there before. On the left, we see these images largely from the Library of Congress. They have a great website where they focused a lot of these. But all of the people working on those drill presses, making parts, all women. A lot of the specific businesses, it would just depend upon those manufacturing plants in Michigan, but 30% of the workforce often was female, which was higher than what those figures had been before the war. And on the right, this woman's name is not important. It's Grace Janota, but I was able to read a little bit about her story. So she was working outside the home prior to World War II. She was a sales clerk. She worked in a department store. But once a lot more opportunities became available and she was able to work in a manufacturing plant, well, she left that job because she could make a lot more money working in a defense-related industry. So you see many new women entering the workforce, and in many cases, a lot of married women who had children, and often it was young single women who were in the workforce before World War II. But during the war, you see a lot of married women also working in the workforce. And then women who were already there transferring to different positions because of the increased opportunity. While women often were not paid at the same rate as their male counterparts, women often maintained their responsibilities, even though they were working an 8-hour shift, a 10-hour shift, a 12-hour shift. They continued to be responsible for many of their traditional chores: cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, doing the laundry, doing the grocery shopping, and things like that. And so women's roles definitely were impacted by American involvement in the war. I gave this a little bit of a foreshadow, I guess you could say, at the beginning of the talk, but here we see a family, okay? You've got a young couple, you've got a child, and a married couple that are shown here. The number of marriages bumped up. They increased dramatically. Beginning in 1940 as the United States began to mobilize, but particularly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. A lot of young people met each other, or maybe they wanted to get married sooner because a young man might be going off into the military, and so they wanted to get married. And the number of children increased, a number of births increased. The baby boom, historians, have some figures dealing with the baby boom, and I'm sure that you've heard the phrase, but usually it kind of begins 1944 to 1964 is often the date that historians give for the baby boom, that 20-year window of time. there was, even before 1944, there was an increase in the number of births. Contrast that with the depth of the Great Depression. During the Great Depression and during poor economic times, the number of marriages decreased and the number of births decreased. So during the war, we see those figures. Divorces almost nearly doubled in number during the war, because what happened is that a lot of people got married. Maybe they didn't know each other very well, and so they got divorced. Or maybe servicemen might come back. And by the way, that figure goes to like 1946, just to let you know. Might come back, and the wife has changed because she's had some independence for a few years. The husband's also changed, and maybe, suffering from PTSD, and he's not the same person who went off to fight in Europe. But many women also changed as well because they had that independence during the war. During the war, the number of high school enrollments actually dropped. Okay. Why? Well, if you're 16 years old and there's a demand for laborers and you can go work in a factory and you can make a lot of money, why do you need to go to algebra? Okay. Also, there were 17-year-olds who probably should, and 16-year-olds who shouldn't have been in the military, but maybe they lied about their age, and so they left school. And as dad might be gone overseas, and as mom might be working more, they had what were called 8-hour orphans. Today, we sometimes call them latchkey kids. Kids were given more independence. And so, lo and behold, if mom and dad aren't there watching the kids and their teenagers, they got into trouble. And so you don't think about that. What, juvenile delinquency rates increased? Yes, they increased a lot during the war. And in fact, immediately after the war, there was a congressional committee that came to a conclusion, and they studied this, and they said, I'm paraphrasing, but we've got a generation of young criminals coming of age in the United States. Again, parents weren't there all the time. And so, kids will be kids. So, issues of race also were impacted by American involvement in the Second World War. So Native Americans were impacted. I don't know if anyone's seen the movie. I think it was called Code Talkers or Wind Talkers. I think that's what it was. It was, oh shoot, I can see his face. I'm trying to think of the actor who was in that. But anyway, came out several years ago, like in the early 2000s. So many Navajo were used by the U.S. Military and the army. They were members of the Army, and they were code talkers, and they would speak over the radios in their Navajo language. And the United States was able to break the code of the Japanese and the Germans. And in some of their codes, the Navajo code was never broken. And this was actually ironic because I don't know if you know much about Native American history and of the boarding houses, or the boarding schools, I should say, where Native American children were sometimes taken from their families, sometimes with their blessing, but sometimes without the family's blessing. They were taken to those boarding schools, and if they spoke their native language, they were punished. And so rather ironic that some of these who were able to maintain their traditional languages were able to use that in order to help with the war effort during the Second World War. Another example of this change for Native Americans is that there were Native Americans who lived on reservations and were off reservations prior to World War II. However, when different job opportunities became more available, they weren't on reservations. They tended to be in urban areas. And so you see an exodus of many Indians away from the reservations and into urban areas as they worked in those defense plants. With so many men in the armed forces, with such a demand for workers in factories, there was a problem when it came to agriculture. There farmers in Michigan, as well as California and the rest of the Southwest, begged for laborers. And so the United States developed a program called the Bracero program between the US government and the government in Mexico. Essentially, they didn't use this phrase then, but essentially it was a guest worker program, okay, where the United States begged, okay, and asked and begged for Mexican citizens to come over the border and to work on farms in the United States. This program was actually in place for several years. And even it extended after the Second World War. And the farmers became dependent upon the laborers of these Mexican citizens, often who were migrant workers. They'd work in different areas and then they would go back to Mexico. And they became dependent upon them because they didn't have to pay them as much as the workers, the Caucasian workers. And so if you wonder about some of the issues of the border today, okay, it's good to understand the history of some of these agreements, because I think it was by the mid-1960s the program ended officially, but what tended to happen is that they came over the border anyway without the permits, and they were hired by many of the agricultural organizations, farmers. But there always was an official program, but it was by the mid-60s it was cut back dramatically. You also see African Americans moving from the South into northern and western communities. Probably about 700,000 blacks moved from the South. And when they moved to different areas, racial tension often developed. You know how I said, like, when they built this Willow Run facility, this place where they were producing one plane approximately every hour by the end of the war? Well, that took thousands of employees. Where are those employees going to live? So the government ended up establishing housing for workers. And for a long time, if you were black, you had to live in one of these areas that was segregated. Well, the government finally developed a housing project. It was called the Sojourner Truth Housing Project, named after a woman who was a former slave and an anti-slavery activist named Sojourner Truth. Well, they put this housing project for black families smack dab in the middle of a white neighborhood. And the white neighbors were not happy. And so here you see their reaction. And eventually what happened is that there were so many protests by the white families that the black families had to move back, and eventually other projects were set up. But Michigan was a hot, was just, there was lots of paper, kindling, dry wood, and we were just waiting for a match to ignite this. And in fact, I think it was in 1942 that Time magazine, it was either Time or Life, ran an article, and they said, oh gosh, things, there's going to be racial conflict in the state of Michigan, this arsenal of democracy. We see some defense plans. Okay, another example of this racial tension, not just with housing, but we see at one Packard plant, there were whites who refused to share the same bathrooms with their black counterparts. And several whites walked out when 3 black men were elevated to managerial positions. It was a walkout that was a short-term strike. And you also see the racial epithet there. Yes, there was patriotism on the part of the Americans, but this employee thought that defeating Japan and Germany was less important than maintaining segregation. Things came to a head in the summer of 1943. Has anyone here been to Belle Isle in Detroit? Okay, so it was June of 1943, very hot day. You had and so there were people flocked to Belle Isle, which was segregated. There were beaches for blacks, there were beaches for whites. Several black teenagers started throwing rocks at some of the white kids. That escalated. There were rumors that black men had attacked a white woman and thrown her over. There's like a bridge, in order to get to Belle Isle, that they had thrown a woman over the bridge. There were rumors that white men had attacked a black woman who was pregnant. Neither of those were true. However, the largest race riots in the United States during World War II took place in Michigan. This was actually the second race riot in the city of Detroit. There was one that took place during the Civil War in 1863. And I suspect people here are familiar with the riots in 1967. But this was the second of three major racial conflicts in the city of Detroit. In the end, 25 blacks and 9 whites were killed. 17 of the blacks who were killed by police. What tended to happen is that young people were really involved in this. A study after the fact said 70% of the people who were involved in this were under the age of 21. Remember I said there's a group of juvenile delinquents? Okay. 70% of the people who were involved were under 21. 25% of the people involved were illiterate. I don't know what the racial breakdown was of that, but 25% were illiterate and 25% were women. So on the left, you see that there was a headline, or there was a caption, I should say, and I think it was the Detroit Free Press. It was from one of the contemporary newspapers, a mob of whites looking for trouble. And on the right, you see a black man who's ready to defend his home, and he's got a firearm with him. Lastly, I'd like to talk about, this is not in Michigan, but Japanese Americans. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor took place, as I'm sure everybody knows, in December 1941. By February of 1942, Franklin Roosevelt issued what was called Executive Order 9066. We've learned about executive orders the last 5 years or so, I think, right? Okay. And so this called for 110,000 of Americans, 110,000 people living on the West Coast in Washington, Oregon, and California were told that they had to move to internment camps. 2/3 of the people who were placed into these camps were American citizens born in the United States. These were Americans of Japanese ancestry. 1/3 had been born in Japan and had been living in the United States for quite some time, but they weren't American citizens. So on the left, you see kind of a poster identifying, okay, you need to report to a particular location in order to, if you're an American of Japanese ancestry, and they often went by neighborhood. Like if you live in this street, you need to come on this day. And if you owned a business, you had to leave it behind. If you owned a home, you had to leave it behind. If you had a car, you had to sell it or leave it behind. And so we see that image there. Families were allowed to bring what was called a camp bundle to those locations. And so you see some of the things, if you had 2 people in your family, you could take maybe, 2 bags or something like that. If you had more, you could take more items. And on the right, you see one of the locations. Generally speaking, they were placed in places in the West that were rural, that were away from others. And you can see that this is kind of in the mountains. I think that one's from Utah. And you would want to get ready to stand in line. People stood in line to go to eat. You stood in line to have your chance to take a shower. You stood in line to do your laundry and hoped that there was still a little bit of warm water left. These were not concentration camps. Some people have called them concentration camps. I make a distinction between Nazi Germany and its policies in the final solution for the Holocaust. These, I would argue, were internment camps for Japanese Americans. Eventually, during the Reagan administration, the United States officially apologized to those who were still alive, and they were granted reparations, and I believe it was $20,000. And many of the people who received those reparations, they got a check and they put the check aside, and then they took the message, and I think it was signed by President Reagan, And they framed the apology. It was that much more important to them. The money was great, but not as much as the apology. So today I've tried to talk about the patriotism that was common throughout the United States during the war. We see, if you think about that idea of growth in the size and power of the national government, tens of thousands of American citizens were placed into camps, internment camps during the war. I tried to address issues of gender, family life, and race with a focus on Michigan. So thank you so much.